I love the excuse of people getting around a table together and having these experiences that maybe they would never have. And maybe they're thrown into a scenario that they would never really face. And I love watching that people watching element is part of why I'm a game designer. Introduction wise, like, yeah, I mean, my most successful game is obviously with Adrian, and that is Sagrada. And very thankful that opened a lot of doors and still continues to support us. So we're really proud of that and excited that Floodgates let us continue to expand the world and work on expansions and now with artisans. So really proud that, it's connected with so many people. But some games, also I love that didn't get big, but they're still, our babies, our cardboard babies. And so I've gotten to work on, just with a lot of different publishers. So I think I'm up to like 30 plus publishers that I've gotten to work with, and it's pretty cool. Small, big, all of them have been, teaching experiences for me and learn stuff along the way. So card games, kids games, family games, party games, and then also I feel like I've kind of started to really specialize in licensed games. So I've gotten to do some with Adrian, so things like Titanic, we won an award for. I've gotten to work with like Batman and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and things like that, which were all like childhood favorites. And I never would have believed as a kid that I'd get to work on those. And and as I mentioned, I also do consulting now part time for Maestro Media, and they're head of talent relations, which basically just means I do matchmaking. I look for games for them and I help them get licenses and then matchmake designers and games.
Yeah, fantastic. What got you into the hobby, and what got you thinking that you could do design, before you designed anything?
Yeah, I never even thought of it as a job, to be honest. For most of my life, I was a gamer, I guess you could say, because I grew up, even as a little kid, I'm an only child. And yet my number one, it's Christmas time. My number one request was board games. And always I would bug people that came over to the house to play board games after dinner. My mom's a great cook and very hospitable. And so there was always people rotating through our house. And I used that as a chance to recruit players, if that was Risk or one of the early games that really hooked me was a game called Scotland Yard.
Oh, yeah.
And I had that as a young kid and realized games could be, different than just roll and move. It wasn't until really like late high school, early college that I got into other games like Catan, Puerto Rico, and some of those really, again, just like incited in me like just a real enjoyment for games. And I got from my mom like hospitality, so I liked having people over playing games. I was a youth pastor for a number of years, and so I'd organize lots of events and started to actually in Canada we have this thing called the Great Canadian Board Game Blitz. Doesn't exist anymore, but it was this awesome event that a bunch of volunteers ran, and a friend invited me out to it, and I got so hooked that after a few years of attending, I actually helped start organizing it. And one of the neat things they did was they had there's 5 rounds of games, and whoever won would win like cool prizes, some free games. And always one round, they made all the games. They curated the list of games that you could play in the round to be Canadian design games. And again, up to that moment, I never even really thought about where games came from. But then I thought it was neat, like, oh, some of these games are by people that live in the same city as me. And I found out specifically my favorite game of the time was a game called Belfort. And it was designed by 2 Canadians, one that lived in the West Coast, but was from Kitchener-Waterloo, and the other one was from London, Ontario. And I lived in London, Ontario at the time, so I tracked them down and introduced myself and became friends and started, regularly playing games. And that was Sen Fong Lim, a prolific designer and a real a champion in the area for helping connect designers and even encourage people to try game design out. And so he started he started planting that seed in my head. That was the beginning. Up to that point, I never thought about design. Even when he first tried to convince me to design, I said, no, no, no. I'll just play test. I'll just enjoy games as a hobby. And then probably a year or two after first meeting him, I caught the itch.
And what was your first dipping your toe into design, or is it a game that you finished, or?
Well, yeah, no, that I definitely the first few that I tried to make hit the cutting room floor. It's funny, one I vividly remember, and I still have the prototype somewhere in my house, but one of the things I was really set on was using the sprues, like the punch boards that we punch things out. I was really committed to this idea of like, what if the game was the sprues, not the punch out? And that you could play with that. And so I remember designing this game using, there was this great little dice game by TMG. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it was aliens themed. And it was just a little dice game. And I thought, well, I'm going to design a game that uses those dice and uses sprues, but it was a bigger game, a more narrative game of like aliens attacking Earth. And so that was one of my first prototypes. And eventually I learned a lot along the way, but I also learned that probably needed to die and kill your darlings and work on the next better idea. So yeah, that's where I started.
That's awesome. I love that. Like when you're first starting out and those like crazy ideas that you have, and it's so cool about like board games because you can take so many, you can have a new interesting look at it because it's still kind of young as an industry or as a thing.
I completely agree. There's so many more ideas that we just haven't even thought of, or just like a little slight different angle. And that's why I think like diversity matters so much, is like new voices, but also different voices that come into the hobby. We get to ask questions we never even thought to ask and try things from just a slightly different angle. And we all win from that. Like the more people that give it a try, the more we might discover.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that was the case with one of our first games with my brother, which we start. Well, it was the first game we started working on. Was it was a dexterity flicking game where we decided we're going to have big black magnets as black holes, and the small ships had key rings around them, and you'd be able to like flick them and go around, but they could also suck you in.
I have a game with a game designer, Sylvain Plante, and we have a dexterity game where you like hold the board and you tilt it, but we put washers in the boards, so and then a magnet on our ship, so that you want to slide around as fast as you could, but you don't want to get sucked into the black hole. That's too funny.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that's pretty close.
There's something there. There is some space there, right?
It's also one of those things though that like later on when you start thinking more as like what would a publisher think about it? I realize like, magnets make things a little bit harder, and
yeah, they get tricky. I was just on a phone call today talking about a manufacturer even offered that as an option, and we were like, that's gotta be expensive. And they were like, yeah, very expensive, but very nice. And we're like, yeah, I think more practical is like maybe just a couple cardboard pieces like slid into each other, or whatever solution you can come up with that's cost effective, weight effective, customs issues of like rare metals and all kinds of other factors you have to consider.
Yeah. But it's cool when they do it, like the new the Final Girl box. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's so cool because it's magnetic, but it opens on two different sides.
Yeah, the double-sided thing they worked out is really clever. When you feel a really good product like that, that just makes you even more proud. And thankfully, like a game like that's already successful, so they can add those extra bits that fans really appreciate because they know they're going to make lots of units.
So let's talk about like game design and like more specifically, how do games usually start out for you? What is your process like? What's a day in the life of Daryl Andrews?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it can come from anywhere, and I'm probably the least a designer that has like an established process because I love collaboration. So I work with a lot of different people. And often one of the joys of working with different people is they have different process and then they bring different things to the table. So I think some co-designers, they have initial ideas and want to go with their idea more, and I try to flex to that. Others, they are more about the development process and less about the initial idea, and maybe I'll bring some ideas that I've kind of gathered along the way. I try, like, from whatever is inspiration. I mean, travel is a big one for me, just like seeing, cultures or ideas or just things that, are beautiful or just draw the eye. Those are often kind of initial catalysts for me because I just think, like, going back to like just different voices and different influences, I want to make games that reach different people. And so I think we're like, not to insult or hammer on like the classic Euros, but there were a lot of games that were kind of samey. It's either a castle or it's the Mediterranean or it's, and I still play those games. There's lots of them that are good, but I think there's so many more stories and themes that we can tell and experiences that we can capture. So yeah, and the experience that I had from Sagrada, where something really pretty like helped break down some barriers and some doors. I'm always trying to think of that, trying to think of something that's maybe a little more unique and a little more inclusive and really could look beautiful with the right art. And so yeah, it could start from a pun or a name. It could start from like an expectation. A lot of times, like, I'll see a game and I have then something in my mind that it's going to be, and then I'll play it and I'll go, oh, this isn't at all what I thought. Well, maybe I'll make that game. And or a problem, like I don't like something in a game, so I say, well, how would I fix that? And then that starts me down a different path. Combining things, I think that's really fun. Like trying to say, like, what would the marriage of this game and this game be? What would that make? And so yeah, I think, as a day in the life, like I'm kind of always just looking or searching for like inspiration. And my wife teases me that she hears all the time, oh, I got an idea. And she'll say, yeah, okay, let's hear it. Cause she knows I'll need to talk it out a little bit. And she's really good at like listening to me kind of talk through the initial idea and go like, I don't know, or, oh, that sounds fun. And then I try not to bug her again until, way later in the stage because I don't want to burn her out. So yeah, early steps in a game, I think, whatever inspires you, whatever you like, whatever you think could be interesting, chase those rabbit trails and see what might come out. And I also try to prototype something really as soon as possible. Like if I have an initial idea, it's really easy to be forgotten unless I like make, version one super rough prototype, because then it gets it out of my head and in the flesh.
Yeah, yeah. That's I really relate to that, and to me that's the one of the hardest parts. Like I find development a lot easier than finding like new ideas.
Sure.
But I think if you don't act on it immediately, then it can just be gone. And
Yeah.
That's happened before. And I've heard like I recently read David Lynch's book. He's a director.
Yeah.
You probably
awesome director.
Yeah, not just a director. Yeah, and he said the same thing. Like you really need to capture that first moment, or else it's just gone. Yeah. It can
absolutely.
Be. Back to one personal question I had, just looking at through your Board Game Geek page. I saw in 2017 you had 11 published games. I was thinking, how did what happened that year? I'm sure some of them were from older and just got published. Then could you tell me how are you look to so productive? And I guess, well, you are so productive because you've got so many titles coming out, and you, like you said, like 30 different publishers, and you're constantly working with different people. Could you tell me, first of all, was there something special about 2017, and then just about productivity? How do you stay in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because like that is years in the making for sure, and kind of like it felt awesome. I'll say that. Like getting to finally see a whole bunch of different games come out. But like the irony is, I think of that year, and I was just talking about this actually recently. But Adrian and I had a game this year that was on Kickstarter called Mistwind. Well, we made that game way back at the same time that all those 2017 games were coming out, and it got signed, and now it's finally coming out because it got signed and released three times, different themes, different versions, and finally it found the right home. And so some games can take 5-10 years to come out, and really, like, we were designing that game at the same time on the same playtest nights as Sagrada. And so here, 2017 was really exciting because a whole bunch came out. But I also think part of that was when I look back, 2015 and 2016 were when I hit the ground running really full time. That was the beginning of me really shifting from trying to do games very casually on the side, and thankfully I have no kids and my wife has a good job, and she said, why don't you just go for it? Like, you can do some part-time work and like I contribute. I did some like charity work and worked for a few different organizations. I was a prison guard part-time and a few little part-time jobs, but I really focused on game design, and especially one of the big things was I went to a bunch of conventions. It was the first time that I went to, more than one or two in a year. I started trying to go almost every month to a convention, and that gave me face-to-face time. That gave me a chance to follow up on publishers and say, how's that going? Showing a game once, but then following up and showing them that I made changes to stuff. And yeah, and I just hustled. It's funny, we mentioned Final Girl, and one of the co-owners, Evan Derrick, he's I don't know what his official title is, but he's a very talented designer and artist, and he does a ton for Van Ryder. But back then he was in a different job that was before Van Ryder, and he was doing the hustle of games. And I remember him saying to me, which it was comical at the time, but he said, man, when I saw you running around everywhere hustling, I realized that is not me, and that my future is not that. And so that was part of his origin story to start Van Ryder, was he wanted to be part of a company that he could work on a game for a longer period of time and have like not the craziness of freelance. And one of the games he first worked on then was Detective, which is like a huge game, like a very difficult game for like freelancers to be able to pull off, because it has so much narrative and so many moving parts and so much writing. And so, yeah, so for me back then, I was like racing from show to show, and I had given myself the goal to sign a game at every show I went to. I didn't hit that, but I was trying that, and I would literally sometimes use the advance from signing one game to pay for my flight to the next convention. And I was like living from game signing to get to con to con. Yeah, so that was, I was hungry. I was I was really trying to get my name out there.
Yeah, I think you definitely have. You've goal accomplished, right? It's out there.
I appreciate it. Yeah, no, and it was fun. I mean, I'll admit too, like there's something about like just putting yourself out there and starting to gain momentum and more doors open. So then you get that positive feedback loop of like, hey, we got one out there, like let's get the next one. Or hey, we got that feedback on like why that didn't get picked, so we can like implement that into our design. Similarly, like Adrian, the way his schedule was working at that time, we were able to really focus on a lot of games, and so that helped. And yeah, it was a fun time that I look back now and I go like that really helped kick the start of my career, and really be able to focus on this full time ever since.
Yeah, and now this is something I find with me now being like full time in making games, and also I run a playtesting and company. We playtest and develop things for different
Yeah,
publishers and lots of different people in general. But Recently I listened to this interview by, what was his name? The designer of The Mind and
Oh,
Patrick
sure.
Lindbergh,
Yep.
Wolfgang. I forget his last name.
Work. Yeah, work.
Yes,
Work. I've never met, but again, a very prolific designer, very talented.
definitely. And what he said is he found that since he started doing it full time, he hasn't played any published games. He says it's like
Right.
almost all prototypes, or very few published games. And I find the
Sure.
same with myself. Like maybe in this last year, I've played about 10 games that aren't prototypes.
Sure.
um,
Sure.
do you find that, and how much time do you spend playing games? And when you play games, do you try and make it educational, or do you just have fun? Or
Right.
yeah,
Totally. Well, I mean, so talking like kind of looking back, especially back 2017. So even like pre-COVID, there was definitely like because I was getting so busy with it, and because like it felt so necessary to just continue to play test and focus on prototypes. That was definitely a season where I feel like I missed some games, and I just didn't play as many games. um, it's interesting though, since then, like just before COVID, I started to really put in a rule, probably about a year before COVID, that I really wanted to get games back in my rotation, not only for education reasons, but just for a love of games. I was like, I got obsessed and involved in this because I love games. And so I felt like I had actually lost a little bit of my, first love of, you know, I enjoyed it because of the games, and then it became like an interesting job. So for me, I started implementing some game nights, and thankfully, not only was I spoiled, I recently moved, but before I moved, I was spoiled to have a lot of local gamers, and there was kind of two groups. There was ones that were willing and able and talented at playtesting. But there was also just a ton of gamers that it wasn't their thing. They didn't like playtesting, or they might not have actually been that good at it, and that was okay because that wasn't what their passion or joy was. And so it gave me an excuse to connect with another crowd that was still board games, but playing games. And I think it's impossible to turn off the designer brain, but you can at least kind of like enjoy games and just kind of lose yourself in the people. So that's usually like, what I try to do. Often I'll even just play suboptimally because I
mm,
don't really care that much about the win. I'll try things, or I'll pull off some good combos. But even like I was talking to someone recently about Sheriff of Nottingham and how like you could just be honest the whole game and maybe win.
yeah.
But it's fun to try to sneak stuff. So like that's where I reminded myself, like, just play games and like have fun while you're playing. Do things just to try things out. And so it gives me like space to play and not worry about the math and not worry about efficiencies. Even if that's kind of the name of the game, it's like, remember, it's really about the people around the table. And so, yeah, I found I needed that. Then COVID was really tough because then I started getting that back in life and then had to pause. But then, like, as it got safe and more, could find ways to kind of bubble with people, then got back into the rotation. And so, yeah, so right now, ironically, I have people coming over to play games in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And yeah, sometimes I just set the rule like no prototypes, and that's okay. Like that, I just need that in my rotation so that I see what's new and I see what people are doing and try stuff. So yeah, there were definitely seasons where I barely played any games, but I'm trying to be really intentional about it now.
Yeah. And I love that um mindset of just play to have fun, or find something fun in the game.
Right.
Um
Absolutely.
I'm the same. Like when I do sit down to play a game, even when playtesting prototypes, I try and
Right.
just play as sometimes I'll set little goals, like what if I
Yep.
only interact with this part of the game, or
Right.
but I try to make it fun for myself, or sometimes I'll try and be thematic with it.
Sure.
Which is, to me, it's really fun. But yeah, because I do think that Like you said, it's just you'll internalize the game mechanics whether you want to or
Yeah,
not, just playing the game. So
yeah.
you can
It
totally
just
design later. You know.
Yep. Just seeing it in action, just feeling it, I think is really important. And then it gives you reference points when you're playtesting later. Like, did I feel as good? Or, would I play this game over that game? Because if I won't, then maybe it's not good enough to invest my time in. Like, I think one of the things I'm getting better at is earlier realizing this game's not good enough. It's good, but it's like, what makes it special enough that I should invest more time into it?
Mm. And you mean your own prototypes?
Yeah, my own prototypes. Yeah, like I just think like I too early on thought like every game I worked on should get published, and then I would get really disappointed when I'd pitch a bunch of games and go like, "Well, why is this one getting picked but this other one's never?" And I realized like, you know what? It's okay. Like I'll have a few, I'll show them around, and if a game keeps getting rejected, I'll just let it go, and like that just frees up space for the next new idea. And a lot of those games that hit the cutting room floor that way still had something in there, but I can go back to it and I can pull apart, pieces from that idea, while still feeling like a little less pressure. Because I felt, I mean, it's still rejecting and it's still hard, but it's just like letting it go a little bit and just having like a bit more of an open mind. I feel like helps me be resilient and helps me like be flexible to it just takes time and a lot of luck and like the right person, right time, seeing the game and having a moment and getting kind of the vision.
It's like the bigger version of killing your darlings, right? When you do it for a whole
Sure.
game. And I've had like I think one of the times when I learned the most about game design was a game that a friend and I decided we were going to spend 9 months on this game from the very beginning. We were like,
Wow.
we've got 9 months, we're doing this. And it's because he
Sure.
actually took a break from his job. He had a full time job. He took a 9 month
Right.
break because they had this program from his job where you could just take 9 months and then they guarantee you your job if
Cool.
you want to go back. And he was like, I want to do game design full time. Let's do it full time for 9 months with this game. And at that point, I had made a couple of like print and plays and stuff, but I was like, yeah, I want to jump on board. If you're that serious about it,
Sure.
I want to do it together. And
Yeah.
we did. And that game, I mean, we had a lot of fun making it. It went through lots and lots of iterations over these 9 months because it
Yeah.
was like we were meeting like 3 times a week. But in the end, we didn't get it to a place where we were like, let's let's pitch it and publish it, and
Sure.
for lots of reasons. But I feel like that, like after that game, like my view just changed on
Yep.
game design in general. And I feel like I've learned so much from that, and maybe
Yeah,
want
no,
to go
that's
back.
that's that's doing your hours, like you always hear about like you need to do like 10,000 hours to like master something. Like that was a huge contribution to that. And we all just have to put in time to hone our skills. And along the way we might stumble into also some good moments, but really that's honing your craft.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite mechanics?
Oh, that's always a fun question. And it's like choosing your favorite ice cream. Like right now, what I'm into,
Yeah.
I definitely I naturally gravitate to worker placement. I really like worker placement. I just there's I love tiles right now. Tile laying is something that I've found really interesting. I love combos like engine building, multi-use cards. Um, yeah, I think also just like in general, like elegance. Well, it's not specifically a mechanism, but I'm just really into like when things are cooked down to their core. So, not having five mechanics all put together, but doing two or three really well, really like in a smooth way, intrigues me. And I think I had a tendency earlier in my career to love adding. And now I just love when you can subtract something and you don't lose a lot. And so that you go like, oh, great. Well, this is a little easier, a little more straightforward. So I think that's what mechanically have kind of been driven to these days.
Do you find yourself playing more or being more excited about heavier games or smaller games?
Yeah, well, my personal taste is probably, if I could choose, I would play medium to heavy games all the time, which is funny because I usually design light games. But I think that's a little bit of a reflection of where I think the market is. And just like doing this full time, it's, I think, very difficult and a huge risk to put a ton of time into a heavy game because you shrink your potential market, and then also if you miss, you put a lot of time into one thing. I mean, even working on Sagrada Artisans with Adrian, we had the assurance of, hey, it's Sagrada, so people are going to be really into it. Hopefully,
Yeah.
at least they're willing to give it a chance. And yet that was like designing 4 or 5 games. I say whenever you do a legacy game, like you're just dealing with so much that you can design 4 or 5 games in the same amount of time. So, we loved it, and it was a chance for us to just keep working on a game, especially because it was during COVID, and especially because Floodgate was already committed up front. But from a trying to do this full time standpoint, I usually gravitate to games that are in the 20, 30, 40 minute range. But I love playing games that are over an hour because you get a larger narrative and a larger experience. Although I usually just don't have the attention span or even just like the ability to carve out more than 3, 4 hours. So games that take, more than that when it comes to setup and play and scoring, those rarely hit my table. But like I love, for instance, and I bought all the fancy bits for Eclipse, and I love Eclipse, but I rarely get it to the table because it takes that long. And so yeah, that I think that's just the way I love sitting around and being part of like a big game that has swings and ups and downs and valleys. And most of the time, if you're making a game and a game experience that's only 30 minutes, it's pretty hard to have ups and downs. You're basically kind of like one big up, one big climax, and you try to, or same with engine builders that are that short. Like you're just trying to get it to peak as fast as you can without it petering out. And so yeah, weight wise, I definitely think shorter games have been, monopolizing the market. I do think there's room and space for people to make some really good 1 hour games. And I think that's a big missing spot right now. I think like we kind of overcorrected and everything got really short or really long. And so, I'd love to make some games that are 45 to 60, and maybe even bleed a little longer. So, yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of top-down, bottom-up design.
Yeah.
Do you usually start from something small and kind of build up, or do
Sure.
you throw a bunch of ideas out there and then?
Yeah. Well, so I definitely, I've changed. So I used to add, and then I'd realize I added too much. It got bloated, and then I would carve away some near the end. And that was a great process, especially because I was learning along the way, and I think that's still a really productive process because as long as you keep yourself in balance and check that you don't lose your core loop or your heart of your game, or if you do, that it was for the right reasons. So sometimes adding things, you'll realize like, oh, actually that's better than my core thing, and maybe I should cut my core. So I think that's really interesting, and I still have a tendency there. What's changed for me is actually doing a lot of licensed games. That kind of puts it upside down on me because there's already restraints and restrictions in place because of license approvals. There's also components and component costs and manufacturing that's a real factor. And so that I feel like sometimes I'm really kind of going top down because I know all these factors, and now what can I design in that space? And then the other thing that's kind of a new evolution for me is I've started doing some games where I've been working with predominantly Wolfgang Kramer, where I take games of his that are 15, 20 years old. He has the rights back for them, and I'm kind of restoring or remastering them, and sometimes applying a license, but the goal being, bring them, modernize them, take what was already really great and then say to yourself, like, what have we learned over the last 15, 20 years that we can adjust? If that's anything from variable player powers, or if that's like, hey, this had a really slow on ramp and it takes 30 minutes, where we could just cut that and start 30 minutes into the game. Or, hey, there might be one extra mechanic we could add to this and it'd be really interesting. Or, hey, there's some parts of this that could be combined together. We don't need that many currencies or things like that. So I think lately I've been really working on actually kind of fine tuning and refining and kind of working from that perspective, especially on those kind of projects, and especially when it becomes like a licensed game.
Yeah. What like when working on a licensed game, or like say for Sagrada Artisans, you said that you guys were knew that you could go heavier because of the IP and because it's Sagrada and people will buy it. Does that mean that, like, did you start out pitching them, hey, maybe let's make it into a legacy game, or let's make a legacy game of it? Or did Floodgate come to you and say, any ideas?
Yeah, the nice thing is, I mean, we have a really great relationship with the owner, Ben Harkins from Floodgate. Over the years, I feel like in some ways we grew up together. His company and us with Sagrada both, learned a lot along the way and continue to grow because of that title. And so we're always pitching or showing Ben different concepts, and along the way, with the expansions and with other things, we've always pitched like, what next for Sagrada? We're always, when people see things, they're seeing what we talked about 3-4 years ago, and it just takes a while for us to actually come out and see things. So it's always funny because like people make comments or suggestions, and we're like, "Yep, that's coming out in a year or two." But we designed that 4 years ago, but you'll see. and it's helpful because it goes like, "Oh, good!" Like people are asking for it. So, and sometimes people will like even accuse us of like stealing their ideas, and it's like, no, you can go look back at the emails. We made that a while ago. But the fun thing with the Artisans, the legacy version of Sagrada, was we had pitched, I want to guess 7 or 8 concepts for Sagrada, where we could go all over the place. Sagrada Junior, Sagrada Roll and Ride, whatever. And we went through. And I'm pretty notorious for having like one crazy idea at the end. And so this was the crazy idea at the end that even initially Adrian's like, that one's too far. And I was like, we'll keep it in the deck. And we went through it all, and Ben just gravitated to it. Like, just was like, yeah, forget everything else. That's what we're doing. And it was like, whoa, maybe we could do a few of these and that. And he's like, nope, that's the idea. Like Ben laser focus was just like, that's what we got to do. And we just talked, like some of them we had baked, we had cooked, we had worked on. That one was just a concept. Like we just said, everyone has a coloring book. You roll just one set of dice and it corresponds to a coloring pencil. You work through different shapes of windows. Like we had it in theory, but we had never designed any of it. And he just immediately was like, I love this. And so we pitched that, I want to say probably 5-6 years ago. And then he was like, a year later, we showed him a few other concepts, and he was like, wait, where's that? No, I want you working on the legacy. And then we worked on it, and we really think we thought we were done designing it basically 3 months into COVID. Like we had gotten it pretty good, and then about 3 months into COVID, we submitted it, and he was like, yeah, it's good. It could be better. And I don't think, and at the time he was like, I don't want to release anything right now anyway. So just take it back, just take your time with it. And then we just basically used like a couple more years of working on it anyways, because there was no rush. And so he wasn't going to put it out anyways. And so we were like, okay, well, let's just keep working on it. So that's why we had the timeline we knew. And then COVID especially just gave us extra time where it kind of bounced back to us, and we were able to really like focus on it. And like our bubbles, I'm sure some of our friends just don't ever want to look at that game again because we probably burned them out on playtest, but they were generous. So
Yeah, I know that feeling. But I remember when I talked with Adrian on the podcast, he said that he was okay to go get into Legacy or to do a Legacy game because you had that prior experience
yeah,
doing Legacy before that. Could you tell me like what are the hard things about making a Legacy game?
sure. Yeah, I mean, so thankfully, especially I did as a project manager for Werewolf Legacy with Rob Davio and Ted Bezier, Alsbach, company Bezier.
Mm.
So I learned a lot, but I had actually vowed after that experience to never do a legacy game again. For anyone who's familiar with Werewolf Legacy, it's best played with either 10 or 16 players. And so for playtesting that and all the permutations of a legacy game, I had to not only round up 16 playtesters that didn't know what was coming, but then I had to, like different forks, like 4 different forks to worry about. So I was like going to conventions and like spending my whole time just play testing this game. I was driving to other cities just to find players. And so I was just like, yeah, I don't ever want to do that again. But when we pitched it, I was just so excited about the idea of doing it to one of our own games that we love that I was okay with it. But I think one of the things that was reassuring was it wasn't a huge player count. It was a shorter game because Werewolf can really go long sometimes, and so for us, we really tried to enjoy all the winks or fan service that you can do with a legacy game, and we kept coming back to like what would be like exciting while not things that would swing the game out of control.
Mm.
So that was always like a constant battle was like we want to give people perceived choices while still kind of keeping people on their rails so that the next game and the next game doesn't fluctuate or swing too extreme. And Ben Harkins was really good at corralling us back in as well because we would sometimes forget that and start kind of going real extreme. They'd be like, well, that's really cool, but what would be like maybe a lighter version of that or a less less extreme? And so I think that was really important because end of the day, the biggest compliment is people saying like, oh, I was on the last window and anyone could win. Or, people did totally different things. One person had so many tools and someone had no tools. And yeah, so when we hear that, like for us, that's the confirmation that like all that work and dev went in the right direction. So yeah, my major tip is, you don't have to do huge things for it still to be exciting. Like still make things meaningful, but they don't have to be swinging. I think in a legacy, you really want things to be small steps, and that it gives people maybe more choices, not necessarily more power.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you guys had like a really good base to work on because I feel like the best legacy games are ones where the base game is like such a good, clean design. Like Pandemic
Yeah,
Legacy and
yeah, Pandemic, Clank.
yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot of examples where when it's applied to a really good system, I'm super excited. Don't tell my wife, and I don't think she'll be listening, but we're going to be playing on Christmas Ticket to Ride Legacy, and waiting for that to be a reveal. That's Ticket to Ride's her favorite game, and so looking forward to playing through that because I already love the game, and then the idea of getting to play a narrative of that, it seems really exciting.
yeah, for sure. I mean, it scratches an itch, which is like there's something new coming. I remember with my girlfriend, she doesn't play many games,
Yeah.
but a couple of years ago, she got me My City, and we played it together. That
Mm,
was
sure.
such a great experience. And
Yeah.
like you said, it's not, you don't have huge changes between games. It's like, well, now you've got this new thing
Yeah.
that scores 1 point. Oh, but take this other thing out. You know.
Exactly.
And I found that game to be just great. And I think Ticket to Ride Legacy is going to hopefully do the same. You know, be
Yeah. I'm hoping the same.
yeah. What are some of your goals as a designer?
Yeah. I mean, lately I've been able to be a little pickier, and what I'm trying to do is actually, talking about the contrast of, say, 2017 when a whole bunch of titles came out, trying to be a little more intentional and work on less games, and games that I can put the time and the effort not only in supporting the design but supporting the release. I think it's difficult for publishers to worry about all the details because publishers are really lean. We're going through seasons of, companies, they'd love to have more employees and more extra hands and such, but and I used to get a little frustrated earlier in my career that mistakes would slip through the cracks, and I was too busy to be able to be involved in the game long term. I'd kind of hand off a game that clearly is not finished, and hoping the publisher would do the rest of the work. And they did as best they could, but they're working on tons of projects, and a lot of companies have one person doing three people's jobs because that's the nature of this industry. And a lot of these game companies, you think it's 10 people and it's two people. And so what I want to do is still work small, medium, big companies, the whole spectrum, but be able to support the titles and give help along the way, especially because I've learned stuff along the way that I can help. And so that's a main thing, is just kind of being able to be more intentional about the designs I have coming out, and support the titles long term, not just like hand them off and disappear. I love the dev process, but I'm looking forward to working with developers and learning from them as well. I was just having a meeting actually yesterday with a publisher, and there's a newer developer at that company, and they kind of expressed that they were worried, like too many cooks in the kitchen. And I reassured them, like, no, I want to learn from you too. And just because you're newer doesn't mean you don't have authority and perspective, and you're going to make this game better. And I actually think like more hands on a game make for a better game, because you're going to catch more things, you're going to refine more things. So yeah, my long-term goal is work with more talented people, learn from them. And also there's a few licenses I'm really chasing. I think there's becoming a shift where people don't expect licensed games to be garbage. And I want to be part of that movement of like making games that are good and like learn from hobby games that we can apply to mass market games. And I also think like that's how we find new gamers. There's a lot of people still out there. I'm a believer that everyone's a gamer. They just don't know necessarily the game they like. Might be a party game, might be a card game, whatever it is. And so we have a lot more games to make so that we can recruit and make more gamers in our lives. So yeah, I want to be part of that. I want to make some good games for some hobby companies, but also some mass market companies.
Yeah, yeah, and it does happen. Like you said, there's a couple of ways to get new gamers, and one of them is definitely like seeing a license. And to me, um, when I was a kid, we used to play a lot of games with my brother. We played like Axis and Allies and
Sure.
Stratego and all that. Then I had a long time where we didn't play, and it wasn't until I saw Game of Thrones, the card game, and I was like, oh, my
Right.
brother really likes Game of Thrones, and we used to play games like 10 years ago, and I just
Sure.
impulse bought it, and then that just I guess changed the
Okay.
next 7 or 8 years of my life.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, and that's a great example of like a really great game company, and people really like tried to make a great game instead of just slapping a license onto a horrible, like Go Fish or something, and you're like, what? That's it? Like this sucks. So and instead, like I want to be part of that, and I think there's room to make really simple games, but still really good ones. Things where we're like, oh, I love this game that's 40 minutes, how could we reimagine that as a 10-15 minute game?
Yeah, that's something that I heard, and I've remembered from an Eric Lang interview where he talked about like he talked about exploding kittens and how that takes, you've got this sort of baseline of what
Yeah.
the general public know,
Yeah.
um mechanics wise, and it just takes it like one level, one step up,
Yeah. Just one
yeah,
step.
yeah,
Absolutely. Because I mean, gamers, we are shockingly complicated. Like we can really grasp a pretty complicated game, and we have to be reminded what it was like, or maybe it was never our experience, but someone else's experience is like it can be really intimidating, and a lot going on to start. I One of my favorite examples of learning this was play testing the same game over and over with the same group. And at a certain point, we showed the game to new gamers, and they could not get into it. And we were like, what? No, our group like excels at this. But they learned as we were progressing the game, but it was just way too complicated to just start afresh. And so we ended up pulling a bunch of that out and making those expansions, which was great in the end, but we almost missed it. Like we almost thought like, well, people get it, but we were playtesting with the same group over and over. And so there's moments to remind ourselves that it's really important to put games in front of non-gamers and see how they react.
yeah, yeah. Well, if that's part of your audience, especially.
Yes. Yeah, especially.
If anything, what has changed in the past, or in your design process these past years?
Yeah, I mean, well, my most obvious one right now is I just moved, so I gotta reestablish and build up a good playtest group. Especially because I think industry wise, things like we were chatting before about like TTS and just like the use of different technologies and opportunities, like even different groups where you can send your games off to get play tested. And for me and my process, like I really need to physically play test and see players in real life. I learned that over COVID, especially, that I am so driven by watching people play that there is no good replacement for that, and for me. And I didn't realize how intuitive, but also how dependent I am on that. And so there was a crossroads where I said, do I adapt or change or lean in? And I realized I'm a grumpy old man set in my ways. And, I always wondered as a younger man how grumpy people became the way they were. And now I guess I found out how, and that is I lean into my abilities and my preferences is human interaction. It's a part of even why I do games. Is I love the excuse of people getting around a table together and having these experiences that maybe they would never have, and maybe they're thrown into a scenario that they would never really face. And I love watching that people watching element is part of why I'm a game designer. And so I love that being part of the process. It also helps me because I think then more tactile wise. Like I think through things like, a classic example is like how long it takes to shuffle cards and set up the game. Like a lot of those moments, or pulling things out of a bag or whatever, those moments are a little bit lost on things like Tabletop Simulator. They're almost done too easily or whatnot, that we don't factor those things in. And so that for me is kind of the superpower of why playing in person, because the product is not digital, that I find it really essential. Is like, when I watched them playing, they got really annoyed that they had to reshuffle the deck 6 times. Like, how can we solve that problem? And it's not a problem on TTS because, it just does it. And so those are the moments that I think for me that I'm watching for. And then if I can work with a co-designer that, is the yin to my yang, that works out really well, because there's certain parts of the process that I hate. So I like physical testing. I hate physical prototyping. So sometimes that becomes something that my co-designer does, because I'll do things like I go to shows and I pitch, and I'll sometimes work with co-designers that hate pitching and hate all the emails and planning. And I love doing that. So I think, finding what your strengths are and focusing on those things are really important. And what I've noticed and kind of not necessarily change, but double down on is in-person play testing for me is almost impossible to replace. I was at Snakes and Lattes this Monday for their monthly designer night, and I had a very small card game thing that I wanted to test. And again, every time ideas seem perfect in your head, but I only needed 5 minutes of watching people play it, and I had, pages of notes of what I wanted to work on. And I didn't have that page of notes until 5 minutes of watching other people interact with it. So I know that needs to happen as often as possible for me to progress a game, is see it, play it, interact with the pieces.
Yeah. And are you part of those first play tests? Or do you
Yeah,
just watch
I usually, I don't necessarily have to play, but I definitely need to be at the table. If I play, I'm really not paying attention at all. I just do whatever's fastest, because I'm really just paying attention to what other people do. I don't want to sway or show strategy. I want to see why people and like try things out, or did they discover it on their own?
Yeah.
And I think it's really important because sometimes designers, they forget they're designing when they're playtesting their game. They turn into their competitive selves, and that kind of affects the results you're going to get. Like, oh, everyone realized the tech tree is the best thing to do. And it's like, well, because you chose it and you started crushing them at it. So again, like I will often do suboptimal things just to let people discover space or see who's copying me or ask questions like, why did you choose that? And I think that's really important. It's like, you're really just an automaton.
Yeah.
And you want to be the least memorable person at the table, and then watch everyone else.
Yeah. That happens. That same thing happens to me. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine I was playtesting with, we're playing the game, and this is a game that we've been working on for about a year, with another designer on. And while we're playing, my friend is like, "I'm crushing you. Why are you playing so badly? You've played this hundreds of times." And I'm like, I'm not here to be competitive. I'm here to.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of playing my move and watching you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it is funny, and it is like comical when certain playtesters don't catch that. Like they just think like, well, wow, I'm so much better than you at your game, and I just play along and go, yeah, I'm not good at this, but the irony is, it's like, well, I'm intentionally punting here.
Yeah, and it's funny. I think he was even like implying like, is it broken that
right,
you should be better at this for the amount of times you've done it.
Totally.
Yeah. Awesome. I think 2 final questions. One of them is a brand new question I want to start asking people. Just for the podcast, who's somebody you'd like to hear from, interviewed? Somebody from the industry. It doesn't have to be a game designer. It could be a publisher. It could be a manufacturer.
Sure. I mean, in general, I think I'm as a designer, super curious to hear from manufacturers about the details of things like why certain things cost more or less than I expect, and what are like interesting things like how many units of something before it significantly changes in price and all those kind of things, because that's the nitty gritty that I'm curious about. I also just love hearing from, and I do this a bit for Maestro Media where I do inventor relations for them, but I love hearing from other inventor relations people. What are they looking for? Why does certain pitches land with them better than another? Even like the process, because I think it's not well known, but like often the person that's the inventor relations person, they might fall in love with your game, but they still have to like internally convince the team to go for that game. And so like, what's that like? Because I find one of the reasons that I love doing inventor relations is because I love pitching. And so like when I see something out there that's really exciting, I feel like I'm representing the designer on the inside. And so I think that's just like a really interesting relationship in the industry, is that there are people that are kind of designer advocates for the different companies. but it's still, there's other factors behind the scenes that maybe we don't know about on why a game gets picked or why it doesn't get picked. Yeah, anything from like, does that game have profitability? Does that game self cannibalize another title we have, or things like that? So I think that's always cool. And then my last one is, I love hearing from like the old designers. So like for me, it's been an absolute dream getting to know Wolfgang Kramer. And I don't know him super well, but just every time I get to hear stories and just his process and how certain games came about, like I love that stuff. So anytime there's, I don't want to say the old guard, but just anyone who was part of the industry 20 plus years ago, I just feel like we have a lot to learn from them, and it's still applicable today, but we just don't hear those stories enough.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I've got a story I'll tell you after the podcast.
Sure.
About that. But to finish up the podcast, what would your advice be to somebody who wants to get into game design? Maybe they love playing games.
Yeah, no, I say do it. I mean, just give it a try. I think everyone should try designing a game. It's one of the only industries that the barrier to entry is so low. I'm not saying it's going to work out, but I am saying like you can try it. You can literally take some paper, write on it, cut up, make cards, whatever, move around bits. Don't invest money, invest your time and effort and try it. And you might have like a really fun game in you. And so whatever that is, I especially like if it's something true to you, like a story that or you're kind of like an expert on, and it doesn't have to be an expert like you have an education necessarily, but maybe you grew up with something, or you love something, you watch all the movies or read all the books about something. Well, make a game about it, and I think that will just be a really fun process. Enjoy that, and when you do that, listen a lot to people, because everyone's feedback's valuable, even not necessarily taking their advice, but listening between the lines to why they said it, and what nugget you can take. But then you get to decide what answer you want to do. I think designers, especially I was guilty of this early on. I listened too much to every other designer because I just assumed like, well, they're smarter than me. And maybe they are, but I was making my game. And so I lost that sometimes. There were a few times where the game I was trying to make morphed into whatever someone else told me to make. And so listen, read between the lines, but make the game that you want to make.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being a guest. It was really my pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure too. This was great. Super fun.